Hello everyone, welcome to Get Snoozy, where you relax, you listen, you sleep. Today, we bring you a collection of stories that will tear open the wounds stitched beneath our smiles. It's rain and thunderstorm outside. As the storm hums against the glass, let this story wrap you in warmth. Ellie wasn't built for love stories. A nurse from a dirt-poor corner of Missouri, she joined the army to escape hunger, not to find romance. In 1944, she found herself in a hospital tent in France, surrounded by the groans of wounded soldiers and the sharp sting of antiseptic. Her hands were rough, her dark hair pulled back tight, and her eyes carried a hardness earned from years of scraping by. Then they wheeled in Captain James Jimmy. His chest was a mangled ruin, shrapnel having torn through flesh and bone, his uniform soaked crimson. At 25, he was a decorated officer, his green eyes sharp despite the pallor of near death. Ellie's hands, steady from years of stitching wounds, faltered for a split second as she peeled back the sodden bandages. His skin was fever hot, his breath a ragged whisper. "You're a tough one," he croaked, his voice gravelly, yet threaded with a teasing warmth that pierced the tense, grim shroud. Ellie's gaze snapped to his face, those eyes, glinting with defiance and humor, locked onto hers. Her heart jolted, a wild, unsteady lurch she hadn't felt in years. "Tougher than you, Captain," she shot back, her tone clipped to mask the tremor in her chest. "Hold still." But as she worked, his voice lingered in her ears, a soft ember glowing against the cold. She glimpsed not just a soldier, but a man, unbroken, alive. And something inside her cracked open, raw and unguarded. Jimmy didn't slip away like so many others. He stayed, tethered to life by a stubborn thread, and Ellie found herself tethered to him. She wasn't supposed to linger. Soldiers were transient, their fates uncertain, but Jimmy's presence wove itself into her days. He'd tease her about her uneven stitches, his crooked grin flashing like sunlight through storm clouds, and she'd retort, her words sharp, but her hands softening as they brushed his skin. She fell in fragments. First, it was his voice, low, warm, cutting through the tense, ceaseless dirge. Then his hands, calloused yet gentle, twitching against the cot when pain flared. She memorized the way his dark hair curled damply over his forehead after a fever broke, the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the fleeting shadows that crossed his face when he thought no one saw. Changing his bandages became a ritual, her fingertips grazing his chest, tracing the heat of him, her breath catching at the intimacy she'd never dared imagine. At night, awake on her narrow cot, the darkness pressed close, heavy with the ghosts of the day. But Jimmy filled her mind, his tales of a scrappy childhood in Boston, the way his laugh rumbled like distant thunder. She'd press her face into her pillow, stifling a smile, her chest aching with a longing she couldn't name. Love stole into her heart, quiet as a thief, wrapping tendrils around her ribs until she couldn't breathe without feeling him there. Yet she said nothing. War loomed too large, and she was just a nurse, her dreams too fragile to voice. The day Jimmy was cleared to leave, Ellie's world tilted. She'd watched his wound knit together, the angry red fading to a puckered scar, but each step toward his recovery carved a deeper wound in her. Standing by his cot, she rapped his chest one last time, her fingers trembling as they tied the final knot. The bandage was crisp against his skin, but her hands felt clumsy, heavy with the weight of goodbye. "I'll be back for checkups," he said, his grin easy, his tone light as if he weren't tearing her apart. "Can't let you forget me, Ellie." His eyes caught hers, green and steady, and for a heartbeat, she thought he might see the storm raging behind her calm. "You'd better," she replied, her voice a thin thread, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her throat burned, tears clawing to break free, but she swallowed them down. He stood, his frame towering over her, and limped out of the tent, his silhouette shrinking against the gray dawn. She watched until he vanished, the air growing colder, the tense clamor fading to a hollow hum. Relief that he'd live warred with a grief so sharp it stole her breath. He was gone, and she was left clutching the fraying thread of his promise. Jimmy returned as he'd vowed, striding into the tent every 2 weeks, his uniform crisp, his limp nearly gone. Those visits became Ellie's lifeline. Her days bled together, stitching wounds, soothing fevers, burying hope, but the hours before his arrival crackled with a frantic energy. She'd catch herself in a cracked mirror, tugging at her dark hair, smoothing her stained apron, her pulse a wild drumbeat beneath her ribs. When he arrived, time slowed. She'd check his scar, her hands lingering on his arm, feeling the steady thrum of his pulse under her fingertips. He'd tease her about the mud on her boots, the frown she wore like armor, and she'd feel a spark, a reckless hope that maybe he lingered too. She leaned closer than she should, her breath hitching when his hand brushed hers, her mind spinning with words she couldn't say. I love you. Stay with me. Don't go. Nights became fevered dreams of confession, his eyes widening, his arms pulling her close, but dawn brought silence. She waited, mad with longing, counting the days until his next visit, her heart a tangled knot of fear and desire. She decided the next time she'd tell him. The words burned in her chest, a vow she whispered to the dark, her hands clenched tight as if to hold her courage in place. When Jimmy returned after 2 months, Ellie was a coiled spring, her resolve teetering on the edge. She'd rehearsed her confession all morning, her palms slick with sweat as she waited. He walked in, his grin as bright as ever, but then she saw it, a glint of gold on his left hand, a ring. Her breath snagged, her heart plummeting as if yanked by a chain. She forced her hands to move, checking his scar, her fingers numb against his warmth. What's with the ring? She asked, her voice a fragile thread, masking the scream building inside her. His face lit up, his hand lifting to show it off. Got engaged a few weeks back, he said, his voice buoyant, brimming with a joy that sliced through her. Her name's Rena. Met her on leave. Couldn't wait to make it official. His laugh rang out, bright and careless, while Ellie's world crumbled, her chest seized, a vice clamping around her heart, her vision blurred, tears stinging behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. Congratulations, she choked out, the word bitter on her tongue, her smile a brittle mask. Her hands went cold, her breath shallow, as if the air had turned to ash. He didn't see, didn't hear the silent shattering of her soul. Jimmy's voice washed over her, distant and muffled, as he spoke of Rena, her laugh, their plans, a wedding in spring. Each word was a shard, piercing deeper, until Ellie couldn't breathe. His happiness glowed, a light she'd never sparked in him, and the truth crashed down like a wave. He'd never loved her, the grins, the teasing, the moments she'd hoarded like treasures. They were nothing to him, just kindness, mistaken for more. He left with a wave, promising to invite her to the wedding, and she stood rooted, the tent spinning, her hands clenched so tight her nails bit into her palms. Anger flared, hot, jagged, then drowned in a tide of despair. She'd fallen alone, her love a one-sided madness, a secret she'd nursed in silence. Her heart thudded, heavy and hollow, as she replayed every glance, every laugh, searching for signs she'd missed. There were none. She was a fool, and the weight of it crushed her. Ellie buried her love deep, a wound she couldn't stitch shut. She couldn't tell him, not with Rena's ring on his finger, her shadow between them. Work became her refuge, her hands moving through bandages and sutures, but her spirit drifted, unmoored. His visits continued, and she'd brace herself, avoiding the gleam of gold on his hand, her fingers trembling as she checked his scar. He'd talk of wedding plans, flowers, vows, a house, and she'd nod, her smile tight, her heart bleeding with every syllable. One night, she found a sketch he'd left months ago, a doodle of her tripping over a crate, his scrawl mocking her clumsiness. She sat on her cot, tracing the lines with shaking fingers, her throat raw with unshed tears. It was all she had of him, a scrap of paper, a fleeting memory, and she tucked it into her apron, unable to let go. He'd never know how she'd loved him, how she'd waited, how she'd broken. The silence was her penance, her love a ghost that haunted her waking hours. The war ended, and Ellie returned to home station, a hollow shell of the girl who'd left. She worked in a clinic, mending small hurts. She never married, couldn't bear another's touch where his memory lived, even if only in her dreams. Nights found her on her porch, staring at the stars, his grin flickering in the dark, her heart whispering what her lips never could. The sketch stayed in a tin box under her bed, yellowed but intact. She'd laugh sometimes, a broken sound, imagining his teasing voice, but her eyes remained dry, her grief too deep for tears. The wound of her love never healed. It sat beside her, quiet and constant. One winter, pneumonia took hold, and Ellie lay in her small bed, the tin box open, the sketch clutched in her frail hand. Her breath slowed, her gaze softening, and she saw him, young, grinning, reaching out. She stretched toward him, her fingers brushing nothing, a faint smile curving her lips. He'd never known, but in that last fleeting moment, she dreamed he did. Then she was gone, her love silent to the end. Before moving to the next story, don't forget to subscribe and comment down where you're listening from. Titus stumbled into the Colosseum's shadowed cells, blood dripping from a fresh gash on his arm, the roar of the crowd still ringing in his ears. Another fight won, another day alive. He was a gladiator, a beast of the arena, his name chanted by thousands who'd cheer louder if he fell. As he slumped against the damp stone, a figure slipped through the iron bars, a girl cloaked in shadow, her silhouette sharp against the torchlight. She dropped her hood, revealing eyes like storm clouds, and a face he'd seen only from the stands. Princess Livia, daughter of Emperor Gaius. Her presence jolted him upright, his chains rattling. She shouldn't be here. Royalty didn't mix with the filth of the pits. Yet there she stood, unafraid, her gaze locking onto his with a fire that made his chest tighten. "I've watched you," she said, voice low, steady. "You fight like you've got nothing left to lose." He stared, breath catching. She was wrong. He had everything to lose now, because she'd just stepped into his world. Titus hadn't always been a slave to the arena. Born in a northern village, he'd been a blacksmith's son, strong and free, until Roman legions razed his home and dragged him south in chains. 10 years in the Colosseum had hardened him. Scars crisscrossed his body. His hands knew only the weight of a sword, and hope was a word he'd buried with his old life. At 28, he was a survivor, feared by opponents, adored by the masses, a man who lived one fight at a time. Livia was the opposite, untouchable, cloaked in silk and power. Her father ruled with an iron fist, her mother long dead, her days spent in a gilded cage of politics and betrothals. She was 20, sharp-witted and restless, her beauty a weapon she wielded against a world that saw her as a pawn. She'd first noticed Titus from the imperial box, his broad frame cutting through the sand, his eyes fierce even as blood streaked his face. He fought like he was daring death to take him, and it stirred something in her, admiration, then longing. Their first meeting wasn't chance. Livia had bribed a guard, slipped past patrols, driven by a pull she couldn't name. She'd stood before him in that cell, her cloak brushing the grime, and felt the air shift. He'd stared back, wary but drawn, his silence louder than words. After that, she came again, night after night, a shadow in his world of chains. They built something fragile in those stolen moments. She'd slip him bread or a flask of water, her fingers brushing his as she passed it over. He'd carve her small tokens from broken wood, a bird, a star, his rough hands steady as he pressed them into her palm. She'd sit by the bars, her knees pulled up, watching him mend his armor, her presence a quiet defiance against her father's empire. He'd lean close, the iron between them cold and unyielding, his breath warm as their eyes met. Their love grew in the cracks, fierce, unspoken, a flame fed by desperation. She'd trace the scars on his knuckles, her touch soft against his calluses, and he'd feel his heart pound, a rhythm he thought he'd lost. He'd tell her about his village, his voice a low rumble, and she'd share her dreams of a life beyond Rome's walls. They knew it couldn't last. Her betrothal to a senator loomed. His next fight could be his last. But they clung to it, a lifeline in the dark. The end came swift and brutal. Livia's visits didn't go unnoticed. Whispers reached her father, the emperor, a man who crushed rebellion with a smile. One night, as she slipped into the cells, a guard grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. She fought, but more came, dragging her back to the palace. Titus lunged at the bars, his roar swallowed by stone, helpless as she vanished. Emperor Gaius summoned her at dawn, his voice ice as he laid out her punishment, not death, but exile, a marriage to seal an alliance with a distant province. "You've shamed us," he said, eyes hard. Livia stood tall, her chin lifted, but inside she shattered, knowing she'd never see Titus again. For Titus, the blow came in the arena. The next fight was rigged. A senator, jealous of Livia's defiance, paid to ensure his death. Titus stepped onto the sand, expecting swordsmen, but the gates opened to lions, their roars shaking the earth. No weapons, no shield, just him, bare-handed, against beasts bred to kill. The crowd gasped, then cheered, hungry for blood. He fought with everything he had, fists slamming into fur and bone, his body a blur of rage and survival. Livia's face flashed in his mind, those storm cloud eyes, her fierce spirit, and he roared, tearing at the beasts, blood soaking the sand. One lion fell, then another, but the third sank its teeth into his side, dragging him down. He staggered, vision blurring, and looked to the imperial box, empty now, her seat a void. She was there, though, hidden in the stands, cloaked among the masses. She'd escaped the palace for one last glimpse, her heart breaking as he faltered. Their eyes met across the chaos, a fleeting thread snapping taut, and she saw it, the love he'd carried, the fight he'd waged for her. He fell, the crowd's roar fading to a dull hum, and she choked on a sob, hands clenched, unable to reach him. The lions were dragged off, his body left sprawled in the sand, a broken titan felled at last. The crowd mourned their champion, but Livia felt the loss like a blade through her chest. She slipped away as the arena emptied, her cloak hiding her tears, and made her way to the cells one final time. The guards were gone, the space silent, but for the drip of water on stone. She knelt where he'd sat, her fingers finding a wooden star he'd carved, left behind in the dirt. She clutched it, her sobs echoing, the weight of their love crashing over her. He'd fought for her, not just that day, but every day, a gladiator who defied death until it claimed him. Exile came the next morning. She was shipped to a coastal province, wed to a man she'd never love, her life a shadow of what might have been. The wooden star stayed with her, tucked against her heart, a relic of the man who'd seen her when no one else had. She'd stand by the sea sometimes, staring at the horizon, imagining him free, unbound, waiting for her in a world beyond Rome's reach. Years later, when her husband died and her father's empire crumbled, Livia returned to the Colosseum, now a ruin overtaken by time. She stood where he'd fallen, the sand long gone, weeds pushing through cracked stone. She pressed the star to her lips, tears tracing the lines of her face, and felt him there, a love that had burned bright and brief, chained by fate but never broken. He'd been her gladiator, her rebellion, her heart, and she'd carry him until her last breath. The stories may come to an end, but the thunder and rain will linger a little longer, keeping you company in the quiet of the night. Until we meet again with more stories.